wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to let our guest, Eric, introduce himself. And notice I didn't say your last name because I probably butchered it, so I'm going to let you say it first.
Eric Goebelbecker. You get used to it after about 60 years. I'm almost a full-time science fiction writer, former military, former computer programmer, former dog trainer, and current also tech writer.
What kind of dogs did you train?
Pet dogs, whatever people
so it wasn't like police dogs or war dogs or anything like that?
No, it's something I got into when we adopted a dog that, her name was Caffeine.
I like that for a dog name. I don't know why I've never thought of that.
Yeah, and it was kind of self-preservation, but I went to this really cool dog trainer school and literally walked out of the first class, looked at my wife and said, I'm going to work here. And if you're into programming, dog training is really cool because it's kind of like you're programming the dogs, except you like them. But there's a science to it that's very specific. The closest I came to maybe police dog was some tracking and some scent work, but it was games. It was never anything like that. Nothing
nice.
Serious.
All right, the next part of the introduction, dear listener, is how we found them. And he was smart enough to find us. So he reached out to the email and said, hey, I've got this cool idea I'd like to talk about. And it sounded cool. And I was on board the minute he said War of the Worlds. Because I'm a history nerd. And I remember learning about the War of the Worlds when it aired on the radio programs and the controversy that caused. So although as a modern listener, it's kind of hard because we've kind of become desensitized to everything to imagine them listening to that and be like, clearly this is fiction.
No, apparently not.
But these people, that's how they got their news. I get why they were confused, but it's also one of those, it's also hard to understand at the same time.
Yeah.
So when did you, before we do that, we'll ask you the religion questions. Then we're going to dive into you and War of the Worlds because I'm interested. So Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Star Wars, only because Firefly was cut off early. I love the Firefly, especially the projectile weapons and kind of how it was like Western. Actually, Gene Roddenberry had said Star Trek was supposed to be wagon train in space. And I think Firefly came closer to that than Trek ever did. But I do like Star Wars. I don't like being a Star Wars fan because of Star Wars fandom. My God. But this will overlap later on when we talk about science fiction, but my father took me to Star Wars when I was about, 13, when it came out twice, because he was really into it. The second time I saw it in the drive-in. So that
Nice.
First movie, back before we called it episode 4, was, I was one of those kids that was like, oh my God, it can look like this. Bought all the Star Wars comics that Marvel had coming out for years. So yeah, I'm an old school Star Wars fan.
I've got mixed feelings. Like some of the stuff people in the Star Wars fandom complain about, they're complaining just to complain. They don't like anything. You could give them exactly what they say they want, and they'd probably complain about that too.
Mm-hmm.
But I also get some of their legitimate complaints as far as not appreciating the lore. And you can generally tell when someone's a fan of the core material, the same way people that read Starship Troopers and then watched the movie were outraged because it was just the same, names overlaid a different plot.
Yeah.
But for me, I'm an outlier because I came to Starship Troopers from the movie, so I thought it was great, and that's heretical. But I get, if you're coming at it with this as the lore, I get why why some people would get upset if you don't honor the tradition, right?
So I had to get over that with the prequels. And so I've been over that since my son was like 20 years now, my son for 30 years. How old were the prequels? A long time ago, right?
90s, I think, late 90s.
Jeez, I'm old. But so, for me, there was Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back. I don't think I saw Return of the Jedi in the theater. I think I only saw it on VHS in Germany. I think I missed it because I was in training. And then it was nothing for a little while. And then the first books that we now call the extended universe, the expanded universe.
It's a extended lore, I think, or something like that.
They came out, and the Thrawn books, the first Dark Sword trilogy by Timothy Zahn, they made a big deal about saying that Lucas approved this and this is canon. And of course, that was all thrown away. Like episode 3, they were in such a rush to get him into the Vader suit, and such a rush to show us the Death Star, that a lot of the stuff that Zahn had in his book, where like Vader is remembering hunting Jedi with the Emperor, and I think he even in one of the books refers to exactly how they got burnt together, threw all that away. So I had to get over them not respecting the lore in 97. So now I'm kind of like, yeah, cool, whatever.
So I think part of it is things have changed in the internet age because you can so easily look stuff up. So it's easier to catch the mistakes. Part of the problem is you're right. George Lucas did not shepherd his own lore. I mean, he had plenty of instances where it's established canon to get from point A to point B, as we'll say 12 days. On day 1, they're at point A. Somehow on day 3, they managed to make it to point B. And I'm like, well, if the events happened here, there's no way they could have gotten there on time. And that was all under George Lucas, which is why Disney had to scrap all of that when they took over. Now, they could have fixed it and quickly re-released everything and given it a new breath of life, new covers, and been rolling in the dough because people would have wanted the reimagined books. But instead, they just threw it all away. I get why some people feel like the current management doesn't respect where it comes from. But like you, I'm also more willing to give a creator the leeway sometimes to change things. If it feels like you're doing it to tell a good story as opposed to just to check a box, I'm there for it.
Yeah. I mean, Andor is amazing.
I liked Rogue One. I didn't have a problem with Jar Jar. I know that's heretical.
Yeah.
I thought it was funny. I didn't mind when Battlestar Galactica made Starbuck a woman. I thought that worked for the plot shift, the way they did it. I'm not opposed to change if it feels like it's a plot reason and not just we want to check a box.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. Definitely that sometimes it's a I guess almost a form of fan service with some of the stuff that they do to check a box. But
yeah,
I mean, like in recent Star Wars, Andor is utterly amazing. They finally gave me the Star Wars universe with no Jedi. I really wanted to see what it was like without Jedi running around. You know what I'm saying? And Andor is kind of like the deep, dark underbelly 1984 take on what was it like to live in an empire. That I love that. Boba Fett, that was kind of a disappointment.
Yeah, they made him up to be such a badass, and then it kind of was like a fizzling.
Yeah, kind of your irascible grandpa Fett. But yeah, and also
they did that. Go ahead.
Let's say if you're my age, and you see a show like Acolyte that you can watch at home on TV, and then think back to the 1970s, like Doctor Who was good. Get some perspective here that, a show that's, 8 cohesive episodes, really good effects. Maybe that's got something to do with my willingness to forgive.
I don't know. I couldn't get into Acolyte. They lost me. I stopped watching the new stuff after Ahsoka, mostly because the fight scenes were just so horrible. Like, I get, they didn't spend as much time in modern Hollywood as they used to on teaching them actual sword fighting, or whatever. If they were riding a horse, they really sent them to camps to learn how to do that stuff in the day. Yeah. They don't do that anymore. I get that.
Yeah.
So speed it up in post-production and make it look cool again. It's supposed to be smooth and fast, and it was like watching a geriatric try to fight a sword from his cane.
Yeah.
It was that bad on the sword fighting, and so that's sort of why they lost me.
If you get a chance, find the scene where the Sith, spoiler, shows up in Acolyte.
I'll have to check it out.
There's one really impressive scene, I have to say. That one really, really impressive scene. Otherwise, again, it's I like the show for whatever.
No, it's totally
Yeah.
valid. So
Yeah.
the one thing I liked about Andor was it really did feel like the everyman. That's one thing Star Wars missed a lot of opportunities to do.
Yeah.
It was always about the big specials, which is part of the problem with the lore, because everyone that wrote the books, they wanted Han and Luke and Leia and Darth Vader and the Emperor and all that. You didn't get a lot of, at least not initially, until like Republic Commando and Rogue Squadron and the fighter pilot stuff, but you didn't get as much in the beginning about just the rest of the universe. And there was so much there they could have flushed out that they kind of let go for reasons I don't understand. But that is a lesson in managing your universe better.
Right. And what they're doing that's cool, and Marvel too, because I know it's popular to dump on Marvel now. I like the idea of, we've got IP like Star Wars that is huge, right? If you really look at it, like you say, get away from the dysfunctional family Skywalker and look at the rest of your product. You can make a series that's for these people and hand it to, a showrunner that's going to appeal to those people. And if you don't like that, there'll be something else. We're doing 4 or 5 shows a year. Something will come around that you're into. Like what's his name who started Mandalorian? Favreau.
I don't know.
John Favreau. Yeah, I was thinking Happy Hogan in the Iron Man movies. That was his project, and he did something that really appealed to people that like that kind of stuff. And at least the first 2 seasons really dug in on that. Right now, Acolyte, I can tell, I think her name is Leslie Headland. I think that's her name. She is a hardcore Star Wars fan, and she was going so hard at the new High Republic trivia that I know nothing about, but my son loves. So that's where he'll tell me later on what all the cool stuff that was going on and who this green lady is and stuff like that. But that's what I do like that they're doing, is they're doing things that appeal to different people. And what I don't understand is, if you're not in the target market, okay, cool. Sorry.
Yeah, I have strong opinions about things, but I also try very hard not to yuck someone else's yum.
Yeah.
Well, some of that's just because it's fun to rags on people, like the pineapple on pizza, like plot twist. I don't care that much, but it's just a fun joke, right?
Yeah. I reshared that. That got me a lot of likes. Thank you.
Yeah. No, perfect. So it's sometimes the joke is just that it's we're just having fun without
Yeah. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm not saying.
No, I know. I just.
Yeah, if you don't like it, you have an opinion. I mean, I'm not gonna. It's not up to me to tell you why you should like it either, right? It should be like, I didn't like that, whatever, and we move on. But
I like it when people, if you don't like it, you can give me a reason that's not just spouting what everyone else says. I'm okay with that. Like it's not for, you can't make everything for everybody, because that's how you get crap. Trying to make it for everybody.
Exactly.
But if you don't like it because like a very specific point, like they lost me at the choreographed fight scenes on Ahsoka, I didn't watch the episode after that. In the shipyard when they found it, because you'd already lost me.
Yeah.
And that's all valid. Like I know people that won't watch any military movie the minute they first mess up a gun thing, they're out.
Yeah, no, and I actually know what scene you're talking about with Ahsoka, and I will say I only stuck with Ahsoka because of Ray Stevenson.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, and now he if there is a second season, he obviously won't be in it, so it's a toss up.
He was such a good character actor.
He was great, and yeah. So
in an age of CGI and special effects, sometimes you end up with actors who can't really act in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
And so it's always nice to see someone who can pull that off.
Yep.
Because it's becoming more and more rare.
Yep.
So, all right. So we're going to move on and talk about the fantasy side of the house, because we are polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. So Game of Thrones, The Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia?
Game of Thrones, with a caveat that what they did in that last season ruined all of it for me. And I have not watched House of Dragons. My wife does. But I do really like the books a lot. I really do like, Martin's grim and gritty take on fantasy. And any guy who had a letter printed in like issue 6 of Fantastic Four has got to be a good guy to follow. That said, if I could step outside of the list, I'm old school. Have you ever heard of the Books of Swords by Fred Saberhagen?
I have not, but I'm going to write that down. Give me a second. What is it called?
The Books of Swords. There's like 50 of them. If you look over on my shelf, those low paperbacks right there is part of the series. And actually, you recently mentioned Belgariad.
Yeah, I love David Eddings.
Yeah, I mean, Saberhagen's kind of like Eddings, not quite as refined. I do like Belgariad too. I have all them over there, and also the Mallorean.
Yes.
But Saberhagen also wrote a series called Berserker about robots going crazy and killing their creators, which has been redone a million times. But what's cool with the game Books of Swords, and they are very much a product of their time of the 80s. I bought them in the PX in Germany when they came out. But it's the Roman pantheon exists in this world. They're all dicks. They're bored, so they make a bunch of magic swords and release them onto mankind and pick sides on who they think should win.
It's dark. I like it. I've been exploring because I haven't liked a lot of the modern trends in writing. Like, I think the trend to not be very descriptive, I don't like. I know why they do it. I get from the literary side that, you know, if you don't give the descriptions, you let the imagination of the reader, and that can be fun. I'm more Team Tolkien. I want you to explain all the blades of grass as long as the grass is important. Like, I like all the description. I know that makes me an odd man out in modern writing. So I've been going back to a lot of the classics, just kind of.
I mean, Saberhagen is kind of, yeah, he's kind of pulpy. Like, you could bang out the first book in probably a couple of days. It's not,
nice.
You know, I mean, he was an animal. He wrote like 5-6 books a year. Like my sister's actually the same way. I shouldn't say that, but he just churned them out, wrote some really cool stuff. But that series has a place in my heart. Again, I would run up to the PX. I was on a post in the middle of nowhere in Germany, and I had to get there whatever day it was, probably Tuesday, to get books because they would get one copy. So I was racing there to get the next issue of the X-Men and the next Saberhagen book. You know, every week I'd go check.
Yeah, I also like the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind.
Yep.
And then Sonara by Terry Pratchett, I think.
Really, Pratchett?
I don't know. I know it's one of the Terrys. There's a few of the good sci-fi, I mean, good fantasy that was by the Terrys. And I never get which one is to the right, which last name is to the right book series.
Right.
And Terry Goodkind with his Sword of Truth series about the doll line of rulers. He's an example I give people when I want to tell you that, like, I like fiction to be fun and not preachy. And even if I agree with the preaching, if you get too preachy, I'm out. And some of the later books in the Sword of Truth series, like I'm a completionist, so I read it because, you know, this was before I had ebooks and could do all that. But I'm like, he was getting a little preachy on his libertarianism at the end, and I'm like, okay, Terry, we get it. Please, back to the plot.
Yeah.
But I'm also a product of the Cold War. Like, I grew up as a military brat in the Cold War, so like hating on commies is just normal for me. That was like the F word in our house. If you were really mad at someone, you called them a dirty commie, right? So like I get it to a point, but you can overdo it even when I agree with you.
Yeah, no, that's very true. It's very true.
And that's the perfect, because everyone's like, oh, you just hate it because you disagree with their politics. Look, I really don't care. Even if I agreed with their politics, if it gets too much. Was it the don't preach harder than you can entertain, I think is the line someone once used.
I was into Heinlein, but he got on my nerves at times.
I liked his juveniles a lot. I grew up reading those because they came out in some of the Reader's Digest editions.
Yep.
But
his later stuff with his libertarian and free love and all that, sometimes it just got.
I read those when I was young enough. I might have missed some of that. I might have to go back and reread it.
Yeah.
Because I was a voracious reader, but I was reading things in like elementary school that I was probably not mature enough to understand the content of. So I got surface level. I found that with some of the books that I read as a kid, and I go back and read them. I'm like, why did my mom let me read this again? Or maybe she didn't know, and I don't know. But like some of it, like you miss some of the nuance if you read it before you're emotionally ready for the content, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those things where, you know, it's place and time, I guess. And then some of the stuff you loved as a kid, you go back and read it and like, what the heck was I thinking? This is horrible.
Yeah. Yes, very much. Yeah.
Yeah, some of the books just don't age well. Speaking of aging well, one of the crying shames of adulthood is they stop asking these questions. So we are bringing it back. What is your favorite dinosaur?
I'm going to go with Triceratops.
Excellent choice.
Yep. Even though I've got Godzilla back there, I didn't think I'd get away saying Godzillasaurus. I like the thick skull. I've been accused of that. I like the like feisty underdog, even though I was actually just reading recently that they think Triceratops, if he faced off with a T-Rex, probably won more often than we'd think. And I'm also a vegetarian, so I'll go with the vegetarian dinosaur.
More bacon for me. I'm good with it.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to think which one it was. I think it was. Oh, it was just came out with. We were talking about it with my son about the Thagomizer, where the Far Side Comics named a part that became official anatomical naming for the spiked tail of one of the dinosaurs. And now I'm drawing a blank. I'm going to find a link to that article, dear listener, and I will link to that for you because it actually was named by a comic book artist as a joke, and it just sort of stuck.
Wow, Gary Larson. Well, Gary Larson was in with science people, so that makes sense that they picked up something from him because he had lots of inside jokes.
Well, he wrote some paleontologist and asked, like, is this got a name? And they're like, no. And so he just sort of named it. And then the guy he wrote started using it. And before you knew it, like everyone was using it, and it just sort of unofficially became a thing, even though it was like, there's no official vote. Like, hey, we're going to name it this.
Where's my complete Far Side? I don't know where it is.
I used to read those as a kid. That was some of the best content ever.
My dad would actually send them to me in the mail from Germany. He would send me videotapes with Far Side cartoons clipped inside.
Nice.
The Olduvai pothole claims its first victim. That's the one I loved. It was a caveman, like his foot stuck in a hole that became the Olduvai Gulch.
I like that. I remember vividly when you talk about potholes where we were going through one of the FOBs in Iraq. It was Camp Scania, which is like the halfway point between the Kuwait border and Baghdad. And there were potholes all over the place. So, I'm doing my reporting in as security commander about all of our concerns going in, going out. And I mentioned the potholes. And he looked at me with a straight face and he said, Sergeant Handley, don't think of them as potholes. Think of them as inverted speed bumps. And that was all he said on that. I'm like, okay. And I can never see a pothole and not think of his absolute poker face as he told me that. Because we had an IED had hit the line into the base, so there was lots of potholes right as you're about to enter the base. He's like, think of them as inverted speed bumps. So I got to appreciate the moxie,
Yep.
All right, and because we are civilized human beings here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, and no longer knuckle dragging troglodytes, coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
If you make me pick one, I'm going to pick black coffee.
Okay.
Every morning, make myself a cup with French press. If you don't make me pick one, I do switch to tea probably around midday. Green tea, hopefully with toasted rice.
You put rice in your tea?
There is a green tea that you can buy that has toasted rice in it. Genmai chai. It has a name, and it is a very interesting taste.
What does the rice do to it? Does it just suck up some of the water, or do you actually eat the rice?
You don't eat the rice. No. You can get it in bags, or I buy it loose. It gives it kind of a sweetness to it. It's kind of hard to describe. It's like you can kind of taste rice, but not exactly.
Interesting.
You like if you go to a really highbrow sushi place, that's very often what they will give you because it does cost a hell of a lot more than regular green tea. But that's one of my favorite teas, and my other favorite tea is Lapsang Souchong. It's a Chinese tea. It's black tea. When they dry it over a smoky pine fire.
Okay.
So the tea has a really smoky taste, and it reminds me of like a really expensive scotch. Like it
you sold me on that one.
Yeah, if you have a really good peaty, smoky scotch, Lapsang Souchong kind of has that flavor to it. And
go ahead.
It's one of those things that you love it or you hate it. Like it's like sea urchin eggs in sushi. Either you think it's the greatest thing in the world, or you're like, oh my God, get it away from me.
Yeah, I can see that. So I grew up in the South, so it was always sweet tea, iced. And then, I never really liked hot tea. When I got back from Iraq and they wanted me to do, just because of the liver damage, they wanted me to do over-the-counter, or they wanted me to do natural medicine wherever possible instead of the over-the-counter stuff. As my doctor explained it, before we put everything in pill form, medicine came from somewhere. If you can drink the teas or the tinctures or whatever, it's easier on your liver in the long run. Obviously, it gets to bad enough, you come to the doctor, but as a short term, instead of buying all the pills, go more holistic. And so I started getting into the tea and I learned if you put the tea in the bags, like the Lipton's does, for instance, you lose a lot of the health benefits. But if you drink the loose leaf tea, there's lots of antioxidants and other good stuff in hot tea. So I started experimenting, and now even Lipton's will do the loose leaf in the mesh bag instead of just the pressed. It's a little more expensive, but you can get it. And so as part of that journey, I ended up at Tiavana before they shut down. They were like the tea version of Starbucks.
Yeah.
They were actually, I think they might have even been owned by Starbucks at one point. But they had a tea that tasted like Big Red chewing gum, like that peppermint with a kick. Yeah. That was so good. And then they went under, and I ran out of stock of it, and I wouldn't even know how to get it at this point, because I didn't remember it as the name. I literally wrote it on the container, Big Red flavor, instead of what they called it. So I couldn't even Google it now.
Yeah, I mean the green tea I buy online, I can't remember the company. The Lapsang Souchong. So the way I discovered that, and I've never seen it in bags, and it is expensive, is loose leaf. And the way I discovered that was one of the places I worked on Wall Street programming, a bunch of the developers were Chinese. And this guy walks by with a mug of it. And I smell the smoke, and I'm like, what is that? And he gave me a cup, and that was it. I was an evening tea drinker. It was just so different. And then with the green tea, it was it's like a law. If you're a programmer in New York City, you have to eat sushi, like mandatory. So now I eat
I guess I can never be a programmer. The idea of sushi just grosses me out. Yeah. I can't do it.
Well, now that I stopped eating meat a few years ago for health reasons, it's avocado and ginger and all that. But you discover this really good green tea, like the Tetley green tea or Lipton green tea in bags. No, that's not what green tea tastes like.
For me, the one I like to do is if I'm not feeling great, I'll do local honey, because it has all the allergens for your region. And I'll put that instead of sugar, and I put that in peppermint tea, and it'll clear a cold up for me in no time.
I do that for the local honey too. I have very bad hay fever. It works.
Yeah. So, and I can't take the pills all the time. So you got to do what you can. And it actually is surprisingly better for you. Since I started doing that, for whatever reason, you would think, because it's honey sugar, but I get sick less often. So I've been losing more weight instead of less since I started doing that. So weird how that works sometimes.
Yep.
So, were you a coffee drinker before you went into the military?
Yes, I was a coffee drinker going back to 15 or 16 when I started working at a 7-Eleven with a friend of mine who is still a friend of mine. We go on bike tours together.
Nice.
The local 7-Eleven had been robbed by a guy with a baseball bat, and the owner wanted two big teenagers that would not back down to a baseball bat. And my friend Bob and I were dumb enough to say yes to that. So we were on night shift, and coffee. Whoever it was never showed up, thank God, because I probably would have got myself killed, a stupid teenager. But that's when I started drinking black coffee. In the Army, for the last 3-4 years I was in, I ran night shift, so more coffee.
That makes sense. I know I actually started drinking in boot camp was when I first got into coffee, because obviously you're tired and it's in the MRE, and when you're doing the field problems, they don't take that away from you. So I started drinking coffee then, and I just never really stopped. Although I've gotten more discerning as I got older. I can't do instant coffee anymore.
Oh, don't go to Crete. I was in Crete for 6 weeks, and it was, they call it Nescafe, and that's exactly what it was. Yeah.
Ooh, yeah, no. Did you ever try the chicory, the Civil War coffee substitute? Have you tried that?
So that's a story. when the first time I tried that was after I was home, and again working at Reuters, and one of our office managers was from New Orleans, and I had a reputation as a coffee guy, and she brought me back a brick of coffee with chicory, and I made a pot there, and it was great. So I brought it home, and then I went to my parents that week, and I think it was right after my son was born, so we're spending a lot of time over at my parents' house. And I'm like, Dad, you got to try this stuff. It's coffee with chicory. And he gave me this look, and he's like, that's what we had to drink in the Depression. Why would I drink that now? I'm like, sorry, Dad. So he thought it was, something you, like you said, Civil War as a, that you drank because you couldn't get anything ever. And here we are, whatever that was, 1994, like it's a delicacy. It's from New Orleans. But I like it. And I think I refer to that in Shadows of the Past.
Nice. I know plain by itself, you brew it like you would a tea. Mm-hmm. And I didn't like it. It felt like bad coffee. But if you mixed it in with coffee, I bet the flavor with the right palate, it could actually work and be good.
Oh yeah, that's what this was. This was coffee cut with chicory, and that's what my dad said. They arrived in New York City in 1929. He was a baby, so I think he's kind of stretching it in terms of how much he remembers of the Depression. But coffee mixed with chicory was something that they would have to drink.
So I did some Civil War reenacting because I got extra credit for it because I was a history major and I went to college in the South, and so we drank that on some of the live living history exercises just for authenticity's sake.
Yeah, cool.
And it was always more fun at that point, for all I'm a son of the South, to portray the Union units in the South, because then I could drink coffee and no one would complain. Until one of the old timers was like, JR, all you got to do is say you stole it off a dead person and you're good. And I'm like, why didn't you tell me that a year ago? But yeah, it's one of those things where sometimes you want to try it just so you can say you did.
Yeah.
Just like I played the pipes at the Robbie Burns Society, St. Andrew's Society, and like we did snuff there just because that's where you sniff the tobacco in instead of smoking it. Ugh. I do not recommend. It was horrible, but it's one of those things where you just do it because you want to do it once.
Right. Ugh.
I read about that now in like a lot of the Regency era like mystery novels I've read, where the guys always have a little container and they're sniffing it in England. I just keep thinking, like, how did you like not die? Because this is miserable.
Yeah.
I would never do it twice. So, all right, and before we get too deep, because now we're going to transition to your military experience and your writing. But before we do that, we are going to show this commercial. So we're going to pause while we shamelessly shill for the man right now.
Alien Days is a multi-author anthology with thrilling tales of aliens, invasions, artificial intelligence, friendship, deceit, and extinction. This combination of stories makes it a must-read for science fiction short story fans. This anthology features Nebula and Dragon Award nominees, Amazon bestsellers and award winners, alongside rising stars in the science fiction genre. Let the authors take you on adventures through dystopian worlds and far-flung planets that will stretch your imagination. Welcome to Alien Days.
All right. Thank you for sticking with us through that commercial intermission. There we almost said intervention, but that's not this. So we mentioned in the early part of this episode, the first part, that you served in the military because you talked about when you were in training. So does your time in the Army affect the way you tell stories now?
Yes. In subtle ways, because I was in from 82 to 89. So, Shadows is set in 1914. So, it's not like a direct military knowledge there other than a notion of rank and chain of command. But I would say a big thing that serving in the military did for me was it got me out of my little town in New Jersey and around the world. I mentioned I was in Crete for about 4 to 6 weeks. That was a very different place to be, especially right after we had bombed Libya and killed, and Gaddafi's daughter was killed. There were a lot of sympathizers on Crete, so it was very inconvenient to be American. That was interesting. being in Germany for a good 6 years, it's where I met my wife. It's where I met a lot of my father's family, kind of gave me a different world view. So I'd say in that respect, that probably has a bigger impact on how I write than the stuff I did in the military. And up front, I saw no combat. I actually managed to sneak in a little window when we weren't shooting at anybody.
I mean, you can't pick when you were born and when that all lined up. So
yeah. No, I'm not. I'm saying, but so I think that if I had seen combat, I'm sure I would probably it would have a bigger of impact.
But you, having seen, like, I don't know, it's a weird time in the 80s in the military because there was no combat, but the threat of it was so ever present that it does change, I think, the people that lived through that.
And I will say that, and that might be coming in later stories. I mean, I'm very much thinking about Shadows and the sequel I'm working on right now. Red Storm Rising by Tom Clancy. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
I am.
The tank battles are set about 10 kilometers from where my wife and I rented a house.
Wow, okay.
When I was stationed in Wildflicken, I lived in the Fulda Gap. So that was an eye-opener, sitting in the PX in Fulda, because I would drive out to Fulda because they had a bigger bookstore.
Right.
And I would sit there with a cup of coffee, reading Red Storm Rising, and he's naming villages. I can't think of them right now, but he was naming villages, and he mentions Fulda, and I'm like holding this. And of course, what's Red Storm Rising about? It's about, well, what if the Cold War got hot real fast? That was an eye-opener. When I write, like, the second book I'm working on right now, which is some of the aftermath of Shadows, and it's kind of a Paris surrounded by Martians, I am thinking about what it was like to sit in the Fulda Gap during the Cold War. And when I played war games with NATO, because I was 32nd ADCOM, which was under NATO's chain of command, I'd be out there in the field thinking, like, if the excrement hits the ventilator, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to my wife, who's still in college in Gießen? You do think about that, and that is something that was on my mind. At the same time, I'm also just conscious of, in the ensuing 30 years, there's been a lot of soldiers who have been through a hell of a lot worse than I was. So that's always at the forefront of my mind too. And if we talk about my grandfather later, him being on the Somme, my uncle, Bastogne, and Battle of the Bulge, I think about them too.
Yeah, it's weird because I grew up hearing those stories because my grandfather landed on Utah and then made it all the way till he was wounded at St. Lo. That's ironically where my grandparents met. Yeah. She was the nurse stitching him up. So I guess it was at first blood site. I don't know. Like, whatever. It's different strokes for different. I could never work in medicine. Like, I hate needles.
Yeah.
So I was so bad when I went through the combat lifesaver course. I missed a couple times, and then I ended up with the instructor because nobody else wanted to be my pincushion anymore when we're going through this course. But they made all of us go through to get certified. And he just looked at me. He's like, if you miss one more time, I'm going to punch you in the face and I'm going to break your nose. And I did miss, strangely how that works, right? And then after that, he's like, just go on being the SDM. You put the holes, I'll patch the holes. It's going to work better this way.
Yeah.
So I don't know how those people do it. But yeah, I grew up hearing those stories too. Did you ever read Harold Coyle's? He did the tank battle book about the Cold War going hot as well.
No.
Look at that. There was a lot of good books to come out of the Cold War era as far as content.
Yep.
Team Yankee. There we go. It's Team Yankee. It's a good one. That one doesn't age as well, I don't think. I tried to read it as an adult recently. It's twofold, the problem with it. Partly the problem is that whatever intern digitized the copy to make it an ebook, they skipped whole chapters sometimes. And then part of it is just some of the style of writing then versus now was a lot less descriptive, and it just kind of felt a little flat. Which was, I remember reading it when it first came out and loving it. So obviously we're all a product of what the market is when we start writing. Yeah. Not all age, right? And so like I still love Harold Coyle's writing, but that was a good one about the tank battle too. So all right, so you mentioned that your time in the military sort of affects the way you tell stories. Do you ever draw on people you knew from when you served?
Oh yes, yes. The names have changed to protect the innocent, except for one. But yeah, so in Shadows of the Past, there is a Marine unit. And obviously I was regular Army, but there's a Marine unit, and there are a few soldiers in one of the early chapters, and they are totally modeled after guys that I served with. And I kind of use that as, I want that person to have some kind of a personality, so I kind of, took after that. And what I do is I kind of have composite characters. I'm obviously not going to take a guy named Smith and make him just like this dude named Smith I knew, but the way people speak, their personalities, and all that, totally.
Yeah, and sometimes the tropes, the stereotypes about various types of people in the military, they exist for a reason.
Yeah,
and so it's kind of helpful to pull on that. I mean.
Yeah.
Even still, you get some of the go to war, go to jail. They can't be as blatant about it as before, but wink, wink, nudge, nudge in a small town, the second chance kid, like that stuff still happens.
Yep. Totally.
I served with some of the last ones that come through where it was official. We're senior NCOs when I was in Iraq in 2005. He's like, yeah, I got in trouble and kind of joined the Army, and this is how we got here.
Yeah.
I actually think there's value in that second chance, though. So I don't hate them for it. Like I wish we could do more of that with some of these kids that just need a little direction.
I agree. I totally agree.
So we've talked about how your time in the military affects the way you create content, and you've drawn on some of the people. Does it affect how you engage with content as a consumer of science fiction, fantasy, and all the things?
I don't know. Not consciously. My science fiction and fantasy fandom goes way back, obviously before I went in. And I think that has more to do with how I engage. I'd say there's kind of a how do I describe this? Like I mentioned stuff like Saberhagen and all that, like old school. My dad got me into sci-fi. Very much so. Bradbury, Asimov. He didn't like Highland. He brought home like Amazing Fantasy and the all those old sci-fi magazines. And so, like by the time I had to read Fahrenheit 451 for school, I had already read it once. And that still affects how I look at content. I don't know. That's a really good question.
I definitely think you notice when they get it wrong more than anything, because the vibe.
Yeah, come on. Yeah, definitely. You notice when they get it wrong, and I kind of notice when they get it right.
If they have Sergeant Bilko, for instance, you notice on one of the scenes, like the guy's got lieutenant colonel rank on his hat and major rank on his collar, that kind of little inaccuracies. Although anybody that's paying attention would notice they don't look the same. So you notice it when they have there's no way a private's talking to a general that way and not having somebody beat him up behind the, broom shed or whatever, like some of that kind of stuff.
I mean, yeah. Okay. So, okay. I was thinking of how I pick when I watch, but you're right. When I'm watching something like Full Metal Jacket, I was pretty impressed.
Yes.
Why am I blocking on Band of Brothers? Which of course is phenomenal book and a phenomenal series. That kind of stuff that's so carefully researched and put together that you really notice. I guess in my head, it depends on what I'm watching, how much of a free pass I'm going to give it. The legendary Godzilla, right? The EOD guy who's one of the stars is just kind of floating around deciding who he's going to work for, right? And that's how he ends up in the middle of everything, defusing the one nuke as it's going across the bridge. And it's would it really work that way? Would he really just get away with saying, "I'm going to go with you guys"? Stuff like that will kind of bother me. Kind of losing the plot here. On the other hand, I was permanent party in Germany for years, where being in the army meant getting up, going, fixing radars, and going home. So I don't know what it's like to be on a battlefield. I don't know how rigid things are. I can kind of guess from being in training, right? But since I only ever played war games, I hesitate to judge. I guess is what I'm saying. Uniform stuff will bug me. Weapon stuff will bug me. But we accept some tropes, right? Like those right. M16s, they all carry, they can all hold like 100 rounds, obviously. They never run out. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes, like, depending on the type of story it is, so like if it's a military or action or a thriller, like, no, you better get those right. If it's I don't know, I was an English major at one point in time, so I had to read across genres I normally wouldn't. And so if you're getting the military wrong, again, it's a military romance, the military is sort of plot, set dressing, so to speak. Yeah. I don't really care as much. Like there are times and places in various genres where it matters more, I think.
Yeah, no, very, very true. And like a movie like Saving Private Ryan, you better get that right. Band of Brothers, you better get that right.
Yeah. It's, I don't know. There are times, like you said, where you just need to get it right. And there are times where it doesn't really matter. So, all right. So we mentioned in the beginning of this that we were talking about War of the Worlds and how, the story of when it first aired, when it was one of the radio dramas. So how did you come across War of the Worlds? Because obviously, based on the episode, you've written a sequel to this. I don't know if it's open source is the right word. This the copyright is expired, and a lot of people have taken, if this had happened, what's the next logical conclusion? Either completely reimagining it or writing from that book forward. You mentioned in the pre-show that there are a lot of people that have done that. So how did you first discover War of the Worlds, and then what made you take that next step to writing your own?
So it's everything Wells wrote up to like 1912 is public domain. I don't know the exact cutoff, but War of the Worlds was 1894 or 1896. I can't tell you the first time I came across it. Probably it might have been the really good 1950s movie. Might have been on like an afternoon on a rainy day when I was a kid. And I probably read the book like you. I was a voracious reader. I probably read the book at some point in my teens. Oh, you know what? Oh, how can I forget this? Marvel Comics had a War of the Worlds spinoff series.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yes, that's right. Killraven. Marvel Comics had a spinoff. That would be the first time I would have heard of it. I bought one of those issues when I was like 10. How did I forget that? I love those books. Anyway, but it's been rumbling around in my head for a long time. And there you go. Marvel didn't pay for that, right? I mean, they just picked up, the only thing they ever paid for was Star Wars. Then they managed to get it taken away. But that would be the first time I came across it. How I came to writing a sequel to it is an even more circuitous route. I mentioned before, my grandfather fought the Battle of the Somme. And there's a story there. If you research the Somme, 1916, and I can get the numbers. The British suffered almost 60,000 casualties the first day on the Somme. Killing 60,000 people with World War I weapons is pretty impressive. It was a standoff in the Champagne Valley, the Somme, where the British shelled the Germans for weeks in anticipation of a raid. And actually, of all the shows to do a good job of representing this, Downton Abbey probably did the best. They shelled them for days, and they missed with almost every shell. It was a huge barrage. It was so loud. They were bombing the Germans in France. You could literally hear it in England. It was such
Yeah,
a
they were getting
barrage.
concussions from all the explosive
Yeah.
blasts.
And then they attacked. And as my grandfather put it when he was interviewed for this book that I'm holding up, First Day on the Somme,
Nice.
not get the reflection on it. He's only got like 2 sentences in it. The British were shooting at rocks and the Germans were shooting at British. First day, they didn't break through. On the second day, a Welsh unit broke through in Mehmet's Woods. Guess where my grandfather was?
Was he on Mehmet's Woods?
He was in Mehmet's Woods with the 109th Reserve Regiment. And they broke through, and my grandfather became a war hero because he had laid out the lights that they had in the trenches. You know, he had to pull the cable to do it.
Right.
So as he put it, he knew which way to run. And that made him a hero. Similar to the British, the German units, especially the reserve units, were basically organized by village. So if you wiped out that unit, you wiped out all the guys in that village. And if you were the guy who saved a bunch of people's lives, you went back home and everybody remembered that Emil saved everybody's life. So he kind of came home from the Somme a hero. And I have to say, you know, the entire time that I was around with him as my grandfather, he might have spoken about this 3 times. And I remember him crying twice.
Yeah. People don't realize, and I am not a science person. For all I write science fiction. So I took the easy science classes as an undergrad. So, you know, I did take geology as one of my science classes because it was easy. I figured if the football players were taking it, it was good enough for me. And so one of the things we learned about World War I specifically was they fired so many rounds into the no man's land that not only did they change the geography by lowering the ground and creating craters where there were none and all of that, they changed the geology, as in the mineral content of the ground, because so much lead was dropped. And of course, the chemical reactions that were at the time, and then over the course, you can still, if you test it, tell where the battlefield was, because the rock content's going to be different.
I was over there and visited some of it with my cousin. So anyway, he gets back to our little tiny village, Lidelsheim, and everybody looks up to him. Now, his older brother had been killed at Flanders Field, Ypres. So he ended up inheriting the family farm, which he didn't want. He had, before the war, trained as a skill as a machinist, but ended up getting stuck with the family farm. A few years later, you've heard of the Weimar Republic and the horrible violence all over Germany. And if you want to see something about that, Netflix has a series, Babylon Berlin, that when you're watching it, it's unbelievable. And it's actually all based in fact. It's better in German than English, but you have to understand it. There were these 2 guys that were Hitler fans. They didn't call themselves Nazis early on, but they eventually called themselves Nazis. And they wanted our little tiny village to be Nazi. And there was all kind of violence going back and forth. Years later, just before my aunt passed away, she was the last of the family to pass away. My father and uncle were already gone. She more or less told me that the one story I had read about the Nazi candidate for mayor being shot, that was my grandfather. There was a lot of violence going back, and they wanted his support, right? Because people looked up to him. And he's like, no, you guys are nuts. This culminated in a riot in the town, and my grandfather being evacuated by his father to America. My grandmother came like 6 months later with my father in diapers. My father was actually born in between the time my grandfather fled and my grandmother finally made it over. So I'm getting way off track, but I'm going somewhere with this. I first heard this story when I was a kid. And probably the first time I heard it, I was too young and stupid to take it seriously. Second time, I remember my dad telling me about it. I was a teenager. I figured it was exaggerated, right? I mean, this is just an amazing story. There's even more. I don't know if you've heard of the Bund in America.
Right.
Yeah, he got in fist fights with them in New York City. My grandmother said once, if he would just keep his mouth shut, people would stop beating him up. But I heard all this, and I kind of put it out of my head. And then I joined the Army. I do a year of training in Alabama. The South is scary, by the way. Kudos to you for surviving. And then I was stationed in Germany. And a few months after I got to Gießen, my grandmother arranged for my cousin Hans to pick me up and take me to Lidelsheim. He takes me down, and that night we're at his house, and a bunch of old guys come over. And this is like 1983, 1982, 83. So a lot of people that from that era would still be around, right? A lot of them would be only in their 60s and 70s. And Hans goes, "This is Emil's grandson." And they're all like, "We're not worthy. We're not worthy." And they tell me exactly the same story.
Interesting.
So I was like, wow, Dad wasn't full of crap. So I always, held on to this. And when I finally got back to the States and a few years into a career, I started researching because I really wanted to write about this. And I found, I remember the guy interviewing my grandfather for this book because my grandmother was babysitting me. That was one of the times my grandfather cried. My cousin found me this book, these two knobs, Albert and Robert Roth. They're the guys that wanted to make our town Nazi. And you can see Lidelsheim right there. And I can't quite read German backwards. Two Nationals, Reichstag, basically two Nazis. Lidelsheim, this little tiny village. I got one more.
Okay.
So Lidelsheim was a little tiny village in Baden.
Can you show the first one that you showed, just since we got you solo, where so they can see the cover?
The first day on the Somme. It is out of print. It might be available in ebook now. This book is dry. This book is a martini with just the vodka in it. This is written from a very British perspective. Martin Middlebrook wrote a lot of books about Britain. Obviously, a book from the German perspective. You'd have to be able to read German. I kind of can. But he spent a lot of time talking about how, the tragedy of World War I for the British were, as the Germans wiped out entire units, they were wiping out entire counties of men. But he came over, interviewed my grandfather, and I remember I was like tiny, and I just remember this guy that talked funny because he had a British accent. He doesn't speak perfect unaccented English like me. But I started to research this, and I came up with a lot of information. Probably the coolest moment was, I'm next to New York City. If you work in New York City, you get a New York Public Library card. I found the yearbook for my grandfather's unit in the New York Public Library, hard copy in the research section, which was amazing. And that's how I know exactly what unit he was in, that Martin Middlebrook was right. And then I found stuff talking about how they were in Mametz Woods and how that's where the Welsh broke through. And all these stories that these old men told me, I was able to pretty much put them together. But I had a point where I had two problems. The big one is I know he was captured by the French. I could not figure out when he was sent home. And I know he's captured by the French because I remember him telling us that he was relieved when they finally captured him because they had food and blankets. Because if you know history, finally the Germans, Ludendorff agreed to surrender because the Germans had no supplies.
Yeah.
And then 6 months later, he was like, "Oh, they made me surrender," but dick. But I couldn't find enough information that I knew it would have to be fictionalized, right? I also this can't be the first book I write. So I'm just sitting back one day thinking, what am I going to write? And it just hit me. What if the Martians showed up with those walkers on the Somme?
Okay.
And I thought about a lot of things. And this would have been, I probably started writing this in 2015. And politically in the U.S., things were getting kind of interesting around 2015, weren't they?
Yeah.
This guy announced his candidacy. And I started thinking about how we got to that point. And just objectively, I'm not going to go down any roads there. And if you think about 9/11 and how our world has changed, I don't have to tell you, how our world has changed since 9/11. How would the world have changed if Martians landed here in 1894, tore all kinds of crap up, and then dropped dead? Because that's the story of War of the Worlds. They showed up, they had overpowering weapons, they ate us. One of the most terrifying parts of the book is his description of their factory that they dropped people in to suck out the juice on the other end. And then they dropped dead because they couldn't handle the common cold.
And they showed some of that in the Tom Cruise remake of War of the Worlds, where they captured some of that gruesomeness.
Yeah,
well.
They definitely did. Yeah, he did Spielberg did a really good job, like taking the little village that Wells had. He actually used Jersey City for that, which, if you know, I worked in Jersey City for a few years. It really works as kind of a village. The neighborhood he did a really good job capturing it. But to me, I thought about the after. So, I think I ended up settling on 1894 in my book just because Wells didn't have a date. But if you look at the world when he wrote that book, you've got Kaiser Wilhelm, you've got Tsar Nicholas, you've got, I think it would have been McKinley by then, who's about to get shot by anarchists and give the presidency to TR. Have that attack happen. Have the Martians drop dead and leave the point that the chemical weapons, the heat rays, whatever the heck makes those wanderers work, it must be little nuclear reactors, and unleash them on the world. And how does the world change? What happens? That was my big idea.
And presumably, and I don't know if they explicitly said in the original, I know they did in the Tom Cruise modern interpretation, presumably this happened all over the globe. It wasn't just this one location,
right?
Which means everybody's getting it. And then what did they do with the technology once they had it? Did they develop it? Did they improve on it? It's an interesting place to take old history and then what?
Right. That's kind of what I did. So what I did was, I haven't touched Russia yet. I don't know how much of a series this is going to be, because there's a fantasy series that will not shut up in my head. So I'm writing the second book because a bunch of people convinced me I should. And I got to say, the sales on the first book has actually been pretty good. But I definitely have it happening in France and Germany in the first attack, and the US. On my email list, if you sign up, and I'm just talking about this, not as much of a pitch, but yeah, I have the attack happening in the US. And I did as a tribute to Orson Welles, set part of the attack in the US in Grover's Mills, which is where the radio show has it happening. What's cool about setting the attack in Grover's Mills is that's Thomas Edison's backyard. So I picture Edison being one of the guys who gets his hands on the technology and develops it. I also have Tesla getting his hands on the technology and burning down half of New York City.
I was about to ask about that. Although Tesla, I don't know, he gets undervalued because his property was stolen, so they misattribute some of what he did. Why do you have him burning it down? Because he was pretty competent as a technician.
He was also a little bit of a nut. I did that partly because I figured it would surprise people. But the story that got me about Tesla when I was researching him was he invented an X-ray gun. And there's stories about him and Mark Twain playing tag in his lab, shooting the X-ray gun at each other. And if you look at some of the stuff he did, it's not that he was crazy. He was kind of a cowboy, kind of a risk taker.
Right.
So, so it wasn't by any means not smearing him. And he was definitely a genius. And I mean, he won the War of the Currents. And thank God he did, because DC was not the right way to go. AC was totally the right way to go. But I took the story. He did burn down a lab on the west side it might have been 1888 or 1889.
So he was born in, just for the listeners, Tesla himself was born in July 1856. So depending on when you had them showing up, he'd be a seasoned inventor at this point. So fully in his prime.
Yeah, he was. And I mean, I'm changing history a bit there. So he was in New York City. worked for Westinghouse. Well, worked for Edison. Left Edison when Edison wouldn't give him the time of day. Edison was a dick, totally. And I don't have him as a great person in my book. He's not really. He doesn't show up because by 1915, Edison's retired in Florida, literally retired in Florida, investing in rubber. Tesla went to Westinghouse. That's where he invented the brushless motor, if I'm remembering correctly. He leaves Westinghouse at some point, goes on his own. I think if you follow the history accurately, he's in Colorado when the Martian attack happens. And if you see the Prestige, where David Bowie does a brilliant job playing Tesla, that's where Hugh Jackman has to go to meet him. That's a great alternate history story too. I am kind of assuming, I don't write it out, that he would have come back to New York to try to get his hands on some of the Martian technology, gets his hand on a reactor on the black market, doesn't have any documentation because Edison is a jerk and is resource guarding that stuff, and that's how he makes a mistake and sets it up on fire. That's more or less my headcanon for that.
That makes sense. Does he die in this fire, or does he keep going?
He totally dies. Yeah, that whole fire is created as a setup for the U.S. POV character, James.
Yeah, I was to say because in real life he died in the 1945, 46. He died right as World War II ended.
Yeah, he died. He died penniless, and it was a damn shame.
It was, but he was born in the Austria-Hungarian Empire because he was Serbian. So it's kind of interesting that he would have lived through all those events to see the rise and fall of his nation. The entire globe changed from when he was born to when, like, so much changed. It's almost unbelievable when you think about it.
Yep.
I think the only contemporary thing is the technology shift from the 70s to now is the only comparable thing as far as how the world has changed.
Yep.
Because, if you look at, I remember in high school before smartphones when my teacher was like, you need to learn this math because you won't always have a calculator in your pocket. Right?
I heard that in the 70s, and I had a calculator in the 70s.
Right, but the idea that you would have what we have on a smartphone. I think I've seen the meme where the average smartphone has more computing power than what we use to send the man to the moon.
It totally does.
And so, like, the idea of that kind of graphic shift, I'm trying to put it in perspective of people listening who are contemporary. Like, imagine one day you're born with, corded dial-up telephones, and suddenly you've got smartphones. That's what Tesla's period of life would have been like, because they went from literally cars to motor T, I think it was Model T. What the Ford, when Henry Ford standardized the Model T. There we go.
Model T. Yeah.
And so that the amount of change that you captured an interesting time to pick to write from, because any one little change there and the entire tech tree could go 180 degrees the other direction.
Yeah, I kind of held back. And that's the second book I want to touch on it a bit more. But Harry Turtledove does something similar in his books with alternate history.
Oh, I love Turtledove.
Yeah, I find his stuff hard to read, to be honest. And I don't know why, but he does that. And I like I said, I'm hedging on sequels because it is an interesting period of time to go and drop off this Martian technology. Because the Martian technology, again, if you read how Wells wrote about it, isn't over the top. It's not like they dropped off quad processors and GPUs and laser sights, right? Heat rays, he even describes them, are kind of primitive. I extrapolated that their horns that they used, that horn sound was a form of communication. So I kind of extrapolated that what Edison would have done would have moved radio technology up about 20 years. And the big thing to me is those Martian walkers must have had some kind of amazing power supply.
So and the other part of that is with communication. The idea of psychics were really big in the time when Orson Welles was alive. So you could also potentially postulate maybe there was some sort of, alien to alien mental communication.
That's what Marvel did, and I deliberately stayed away from it.
I haven't read the Marvel stuff, but I'm curious now to check it out.
There's probably a way to pick them up on Comixology. They're very 70s comics. Killraven's a super cool character. But the comics are very uneven. The best issues, in my opinion, would be the ones illustrated by Herb Trimpe, who used to do the Hulk. I was a big Hulk fan as a kid. But they're totally psychic. I was staying away from that because it was too easy to slip into fantasy. I was trying to make it hard for myself. So I kind of focused on the idea of the power supply and the idea of mounting heat rays on tanks.
Well, I mean, if you went with the mental communication, that makes it where the tech is not as 100% compatible, which gives you a limitation because humans can't do that. So.
Well, the one problem I have now is how the Martians communicate with humans, which I'm kind of wrestling with in the second book. But so what I did is I've got 2 POV characters in Shadows. The one is in the U.S. So there were radio towers in Sayreville, Long Island, that communicated with Germany. And actually, they only communicated with Germany in the real world. I almost flipped over to my world, where they were also the UK. There were radio towers on both sides of the Atlantic by 1910, 1912. They actually did Morse code with like these massive units that created a big enough arc that the arc traveled over the ocean. What I have in my book is they were rebuilt with Martian technology, so you could actually do voice.
Nice.
On the U.S. side, there's a conspiracy involving those radios. On the Europe side, World War I happened a lot faster because of all those extra weapons. The Kaiser got a hell of a lot more energetic than he was in our real world. So World War I is kind of happening. So I'm able to recreate the Somme a few years earlier because, World War I, the Schlieffen plan was get the hell to the ocean as fast as you can, then head south to Paris. That plan was written years before World War I, so I'm assuming they're enacting that plan. They're just using Martian weapons to do it.
So one of the other things, like how much did you play with, because now you're talking alt history, all bets are off, right? You can do things a little differently within reason and still keep the vibe, the je ne sais quoi. How much did you stick with, like part of the problem with Germany was the Kaiser listened to his generals and didn't trust his gut there's a few instances where if he had listened to his own opinion and said, no, this isn't right, instead of letting his generals browbeat him, they could have at least gotten a stalemate and a better peace, if not one. But their problem, Germans' problems, was the hidebound nature of their generals, not being as adaptive. Did you play with any of that, or is this told mostly from the American POV?
No. So it's told from an American radio tech's viewpoint and a German army private's viewpoint. But that what you're talking about doesn't really come into play because the Germans are kicking ass, and the Martians show up again.
Oh, so they come back for round 2?
Yes.
Nice. Is the technology the same when you do them coming back, or do you have differences and improvements?
There's subtle differences, and I got to say, I this book went through several iterations. There was an iteration where I actually had them using a black smoke that masks didn't work with, and I can't remember why I pulled that out. I should bring that back. And so the one thing that I haven't used that I think you'll appreciate, and I may bring this in a future book, is about the Tunguska event.
Yeah. And
Warren Ellis is probably the most brilliant guy to ever use that. He used that as how the Silver Surfer lands on Earth. But I had a prequel where that was a supply run for the Martians making their second attack. And I ended up pulling it out for space in the first book because the first book got way bigger than I wanted it to be. But what I kind of am hinting at in this first book and will bring more to light in the second book is the Martians didn't all die. If you think in terms of any, what did we just have? Not an epidemic, but a pandemic. You think of any pandemic, even if you don't have a vaccine, it doesn't kill everybody. right? There's always some subset of well, not always, but usually some subset of the population that can survive it. So I figured not all the Martians died.
Because of
And then
mutations
some,
and such.
right. And I also figured they would have sympathizers because there's always dicks. Right? That's a constant in the universe, is there's always a dick. So I kind of have what they did is they laid back for 20 years and decided we're going to do this differently. So the first one is they go to Europe first. And the reason why they attack Europe is Europe already has this horrible war going on. Great time for us to go in there, take advantage of the confusion. Meanwhile, over in the US, what I was talking about was the political destabilization of the attack. There was a guy who constantly ran for president called Williams Jennings Bryan. And he was a populist, kind of a nut. I know in the 1896, years might be off, election, he wanted to put us on like the silver standard. He was a rabid Christian fundamentalist. He was actually involved in the Scopes monkey trial for the prosecution years later. I have him winning the presidency.
Oh, that would change things.
Very much. So by the time that my book opens up, we have a national police force. It's a very different America. So the Martians are like, yeah, we don't need to attack that place yet. We can hold off. They're doing fine. And that's where the idea of a conspiracy over in the US comes in. So, yeah.
If you find the Tunguska event interesting, we've interviewed him, but Rick Shaw did a book called The Tunguska Deception, where he played on that and that's not something you read people touch a lot just because it, is before some of the modern technology. And so it's an interesting thing to study. But right now, how long is the first book? Like, word count pages, something that readers can get an idea.
It's right around 100K words. I think it's a little bit less, maybe 98.
So probably about 10 hours on audio if somebody was doing a dictation or audiobook.
I actually very quietly did an AI one and uploaded it to Google, and nobody has bought it.
How long was it, lengthwise?
I could probably pull it up.
I mean, I'm not opposed to the AI audiobook. I won't listen to them because they bug me. But I get if you're on a budget, but you've got difficulties where you can't read, but you can listen because, vision issues or whatever. Like I get the adaptive tech angle. So I'm kind of an odd man out on that with most authors. Amazon has the voice narration, audio, AI voice, whatever they do too, which is crap.
So I did it out of lark just to see what would happen. I don't want to read an audiobook. I used to host a podcast years and years and years ago, and I could not stand to listen to myself.
I hate editing my own voice. I feel your pain.
And I've got that coffee New Jersey accent. So yeah, I would like to get enough money off with the second book, hopefully have enough money. I would happily pay a voice actor. I'd love to do that. But quitting the day job on Wall Street, money's a little tight. I think it came out to about 8 hours. Yeah. And also I wouldn't, I'm also kind of spoiled where I have two very different characters. I wouldn't mind having the money to pay two different actors to do it.
That's becoming more popular, the dual narration.
Yeah, I actually really get into graphic audio, by the way. I love their books. I don't know if you ever listened to some of their stuff, but they do a full cast type thing.
I have not, but I'll have to check it out.
That's how I read Brandon Sanderson, was the full cast graphic audio. That's probably blasphemy for Brandon Sanderson fans, but I loved it.
Why would that be blasphemy?
Because they actually adapt the scripts. So the dialogue is the same, but they will replace a bell rang with a bell ringing type of thing.
Oh, okay. So yeah,
I love it.
It's like an old-timey radio program like they used to do back in the day.
Yeah, which actually another way I kind of got into sci-fi and at least genre was CBS Radio Mystery Theater was a big deal in the 70s. My dad would actually take me in the car and drive around and we'd listen to it because it was the 70s. You couldn't stream it. Yeah, so it's about 100K words. That works out to 356 pages or something, I think, on an e-reader. The second book is going to be a bit shorter because I'm only going to have one POV character. One of the supporting characters in the first book is the POV character in the second book. And the second book is The Siege of Paris. I don't know what else.
So World War One was known for one of the big innovations they gave us is the modern tank.
Yep.
As they try to break the stalemate. Does that play into your world? Because
yeah, I lost that thread. Yes, very much. And actually, what's hilarious is I have a tank in the end. And one of the reviewers that still gave me 4 stars criticized me for having tanks in World War One. Sigh.
Does he not realize that the Siegfried line, or was it the Siegfried line? No, the line in France, between France and Germany. I'm drawing a blank.
Siegfried.
Is it Siegfried? Yeah. Some of those gun emplacements were actually just World War One tanks that weren't good enough anymore. So they buried them in cement, and now the tank is a mobile or is a fixed gun battery. You can still see some of those today.
I have an imaginary tank model version based on a version that Germany didn't get out the door. In my
there
world,
was lots of models.
Right. In my world, they get another one out the door a little faster. And there's references to a British version that they kind of stole some of the ideas from because that stuff was going on. And that tank ends up in one of the climactic battles in the end of the German POV story. That tank ends up playing a very big part in it. That's all I want to say.
That's cool. So the other big thing that came out of it, aside from the role machine guns play, which I don't know that this Martian technology is going to make much of a difference there. I mean, the technology is going to be the technology. You might see other things to go with it, like, the lasers and whatnot. But marksmanship really became more like the concept of the modern sniper really started and gained ground and became more professional in World War One. I mean, not to say we didn't have sharpshooters, but it wasn't as formalized where there were training schools and whatnot. Do you play on any of that? Because, presumably optical capabilities from these alien ships would be better than what we would have had with just, magnifying glass.
There are a couple scenes where marksmanship plays a part, but nothing involving the Martians because I have them being effectively blind, communicating over sound. And because the description that Wells has of the aliens, I think these are decisions I made so long ago. He either refers to there not being eyes or the eyes being very cloudy. So I made them very oral focused, AUROL focused.
So that would be where echolocation, that sort of thing?
That kind of thing, yes. And again, that played into my idea of the radios being a big deal in the American plot, American storyline.
If you decide to go for the angle with the gas that the mask didn't work, one thing to play into is the evolution of the gas mask, because at first it was literally just cloth that they soaked in urine and tied around their face, and eventually it evolved, and then there are various versions of the gas mask as the war progressed and what they were sending changed.
Yep.
So when you set this off, and the tech tree there would play a factor as well, I would be interesting to play with.
It would be, yeah. I mean, like I said, it's interesting. I've got a lot of ideas for this universe, but this fantasy universe is will not shut up. I got voices.
So let me ask you this. So does the first book, obviously you're working on the second one, does the first one end enough that it doesn't feel like a cliffhanger?
Oh, no. Yeah. It very much ends. Yes, it ends. When I finished that book, I was going to move on to the other story. And several people told me, no, you really should do a second book this year. Because especially they say a new author should get a series out there. So, but both stories have very conclusive endings, but with the possibility of more to happen. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I hate that. Yeah. I didn't want to do like a Harry Potter thing with the last 2 books. No, I didn't want to do that.
So we didn't ask this, but we do have some families that listen to the podcast. What would you say the age range for this story would be? Like target demographic, don't let them read it before if they're underage kind of thing. Like where would you put the content?
Young teen. I mean, there's a couple deaths, but they're not graphic. I'm pretty sure I'm PG on the language. I might even be G. Nobody has a potty mouth. There are a couple scenes where people die, right? And it's sad, but like Old Yeller type thing. You know what I mean?
Right.
But I would say they're not, so 12, 13 would be fine. I think the limiting factor on age would have more to do with people that care about classic War of the Worlds and World War One.
Right.
That's what I was thinking about. I was thinking like this is probably a age 35 and up, more because of what it's about than the content, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. To get the right vibe, though, for the men out there, you need to listen to this audiobook while you're grilling something on the charcoal, just so you get that ambiance just right. Maybe with a cigar and a brandy. I don't know.
I have a cigar smoking guy in there. The sergeant smokes cigar.
So did you have any trouble when you were doing this, like getting the language? Because one of the things that'll throw people out of historical books is they have everybody talking in modern terms, and the cadence of speech was different at various points in time. The words they would have used is different. Did you play with any of that, or did you just write in modern?
I wrote in mostly modern. So I mentioned before, there's plenty of people that have written sequels and complementary stories to War of the Worlds, and most of the ones, not most, but many of the ones I came across stuck with that 19th century vernacular, and even I found it like distracting. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm a guy who reads Dickens, for crying out loud. But I just wanted something with a more modern voice. So I think I found a happy medium. Over with the German characters, I do throw in some German words just for authenticity. But I make it clear what they mean. But I went with a more modern voice.
Okay.
And
that
it was a stylistic choice because, like I said, there's a couple of really good authors out there. Mark Hood is the one whose name off the top of my head, who has 2 or 3 ebooks in the War of the Worlds universe, and he writes in that 19th century dialect. They're also very short, right? Because I think that if you're going to write like that, nobody's going to stick with you for 100,000 words, in my opinion.
You can do it if you just do a patina over it without being full blown.
Mm-hmm.
Like I wrote a scene where I actually had to research it, which is why I thought to ask, because I'm writing a scene about people going into a fantasy world from the modern times, and one of the guys goes to the afterlife and ends up coming back. But as part of that, the guy in front of him in line waiting to be judged died in the 1920s, right after coming back from World War I. And so I have him speaking in some of that vernacular, and I had to look a lot of it up to make it authentic. And I'm like, it sounds cool because it was like a 3-sentence dialogue exchange. But if I had to write that the entire freaking time, I would have shot myself. It was painful.
I think and again, it's right. It's who's your market. So this guy, like, I think you can download one of his books free, like a typical, like it's a what do they call it? The giveaway for a list.
Right.
And he wrote a book from, or novella, I think you would call it, from the protagonist in War of the Worlds doesn't have a name, right? I think this guy decided to call him HG. He wrote a book from his wife's perspective that covers the same ground as the first book. And it's really cool. And it's written in that kind of vernacular, because what keeps happening is the star of War of Worlds keeps leaving his wife. He keeps running off and getting all these adventures, then come back to his wife. And it was kind of interesting to be like, so what was going on with her? And, and it's like 20, maybe 30,000 words, and it's great. But like you're saying, I think that writing that for, what most sci-fi guys expect, 80, 90K, would be tough. And I wonder how many people would stick with it.
Yeah, it'd be difficult. I mean, you could get away with it if it's only in the dialogue, but even that gets a little...
Right. Because me, I read a lot for years. When I was working as a programmer, I didn't have a lot of time to read. I would read a lot of old stuff over again, like Saberhagen and all that. And now, more recently, I've been reading newer sci-fi and newer books. And I'm really, I'll be honest, the changes that have happened in the past 20, 30 years, I like. I like the faster pace. I like the
more workman-like prose, I think.
Yeah, more direct, like Blake Crouch. I don't know if you're familiar with Blake Crouch. He wrote Dark Matter.
Okay.
And Dark Matter is a great series on Apple TV Plus, a limited series, just 8 episodes. And I heard an interview with him, and the guy asked him who his influences were, and he was like Michael Crichton, Pat Conroy, and what's his name? Silence of the Lambs, Thomas Harris. And he said he basically writes thrillers that are science fiction. And that's really changed the way I've looked at writing the past year.
Okay.
And it's, yeah, no, it's, how did he put it? I just did a TikTok about this. Asking questions at breakneck pace is the way he put it. And reading about that, it kind of changed the way I looked at modern writing and the way people write now, that I want to get better at that. So yeah, I will say it is a sequel to War of the Worlds, but it does not read at all like H.G. Wells. It's set in that universe he created. And of course, the other thing is if that attack happened, maybe the time machine exists. That would be interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of fertile ground. I like kind of reimagining. So I'm definitely gonna have to check this out. You said you think you're gonna try to do audio?
I'm gonna probably try to do audio for both books later this year. I'm thinking about it.
Okay. When you get that out, reach back out, because I'll buy a copy and do a review for Upstream Reviews. I write book reviews for their website. Right. But I just, with the head injury, I can only look at a screen for so many hours a day. And so I can read a book on audiobook and then get words in for my writing, or I can read someone else's. And, my publishers that I sign contracts with are kind of like, JR, are you going to finish that? So, you know what I mean? Stuff happens.
I get it. I really want, I did the AI thing for the hell of it. I haven't been promoting it. I'm as somebody in the programming world, I've got some pretty strong opinions about AI. So I would like to hire 1 or 2 really good actors and have both books done the right way.
Oh, no, I totally feel that. Then the other problem is where the AIs are training themselves off of, and a lot of that is pirated content.
That's exactly it. I listen to a lot of audiobooks too. And those actors are great. And the fact that, we got to have an AI just like so it's a such an actor. It's like, no. That's not right.
Yeah. So, and it's also possible you could potentially, well, you said you don't want to, but some people will do their own.
Yeah, that's a hard sell for me.
I get it. I couldn't do the accents, and I definitely couldn't do some of the voices that people are doing. It would sound bad. What you hear is what you get with me.
Yeah, that's pretty much the same with me.
So, was there anything we didn't ask about this book series that you want to tell us before we wrap this up?
No, I think I blathered everything. The second book is on pre-order. The date's probably about to move due to some family stuff, a month to December. But I don't know when this is going to air.
I don't know. I'd have to check. I know we generally record about a month in advance.
Okay. All right. So the special that's going on right now wouldn't be on then.
No, but you can definitely go to our Facebook group and share it there for sure.
Okay, cool. No, this was great. I really appreciate it.
This was fun. So, what you're writing book 2 now? What's the fantasy series? Could you give us the Reader's Digest version of it, so we know what to look for?
It's, how do I put this? I love Highlander, the movie Highlander and the TV series.
Oh, absolutely.
And the first time I saw Highlander, I think my dad had sent it to me on VHS. He sent me the coolest stuff. And I was blown away. But one thing that annoyed me, but I knew it was necessary with the TV series, was there was a gazillion immortals. I'm thinking of a universe where there's only two. And they really don't like each other. And what really gave me the idea for it was, imagine these two immortals have been around since like prehistoric days. If you know DC Comics, Vandal Savage, are you familiar with him? He's I think he's actually a Cro-Magnon, and he's still around, and he's not dumb. He's like a schemer. And but I'm picturing these two immortals that are kind of fighting their battle back and forth throughout history, and each storyline would be a critical point in history. So imagine the good guys around when they invent the printing press, and the bad guy doesn't want it to happen. And of course, they're immortal, right? So they can't kill each other. That's the gem of the idea in there. And the part that I'm struggling with, and I really have to not think about this because I have a book to finish, is I'm imagining right now, and I don't know if I have the guts to do it. Every book is a different POV. The immortal guys are never the POV characters.
That could be interesting. I mean, color me curious. I'm there for it.
Yeah, but it shows up at when I'm struggling with a scene, and you know how it is, the resistance, as Stephen Pressfield calls it. So I'm trying to struggle with a scene in the book I'm writing, and I'm like, yeah, but wouldn't it be cool if you could do this? And I have to stop and work on the book in front of me. So
yeah, that can get in your way if you're not careful. I definitely feel you. That's why I try to avoid books that are going to make me go nuts on the research, because I do like research. I'm like, I could disappear for a decade, and then people are going to be really, really upset because at the end of that, I'll have had a lot of fun, but I'll have sold nothing.
Well, where this idea came from was I rewatched Highlander for the 3,000th time. And then I came across on YouTube an old TV show from the 70s and 80s called Connections. He just did a new set of episodes. The guy must be like 90 for Curiosity Stream. And Connections is this guy, like, you go search for Connections on YouTube and look for the British guy with the bad hairline. He takes different technologies over centuries and connects them. Like the invention of this type of crate to move olives led to this type of press for olive oil, led to this type of printing press type of thing. And he'll go from the year 900 to 1970.
I've seen that done with the Roman chariot, pushing it all the way to space travel because of the standardization of the Roman chariot, right. So the roads, and so on and so on. Yeah,
that kind of idea. But he did it for PBS in the 70s. Well, actually, he did it for BBC in the 70s, and PBS brought over. Another eclectic thing my dad got me into. And I was looking at these moments in history, and I'm like, this is so cool. Hang a fantasy story around it. What kind of stuff could you do? So that's kind of where that idea came from. And it would be kind of light fantasy. I'm getting into fantasy that isn't completely over the top, alternate universe, but just little touches.
So more urban fantasy?
Yeah, kind of urban fantasy. Yeah. The Kevin Hearn series got me into that idea. I never thought I would read urban fantasy, and I read his Iron Druid.
Okay. Series. All right. So where can listeners and viewers at home find you on the internet?
EricGoebelbecker.com is my website, sadly neglected. I have a link tree, so linktra.e Goebelbecker. If you do first initial, last name, that's where you'll find me where I am. So my Facebook page is E Goebelbecker. TikTok, I'm hanging with the kids. E Goebelbecker. Instagram, E Goebelbecker. I'm not on Twitter. I think that covers most of it right there.
Okay, I will get those links from you in the post show.
Yep.
We will share that out. So if you have to, if you want to check him out, that'll be there. You can follow us on our link tree, linktr.ee, linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast, where we link to all the things, the bits, shoots, the rumbles, the YouTubes, the TikToks, our Twitter. We got our email, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. We have our Facebook group and Facebook page. And more importantly, we have Madam Stabby Stab on the Instagram, Twitter, and email. You can find our website link there on Spotify. It's a bunch of gobbledygook, so trust me, just go to the link tree. And once you get there, you can support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on. Or you can support the show more directly by going to buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that it's for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink that coffee brand coffee till it pours out of their hair. We haven't done that one before. And if you use the code in the link in the show notes, code podcast Grunt, you get 10% off. Support an American company brewing here, hiring Americans. It's, if that matters to you. And for you people that are overseas, we will try to find some local businesses for you and see if we can hook up some discounts for you guys over there, because I don't think Coffee Brand Coffee ships internationally yet. With that, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. Thank you for coming on, sir.
Thank you. This is great.
This was fun. And with that, we are out. Wait for it.